It's great to welcome to the program today Nicholas Christakis, Sterling Professor of Social Natural Science at Yale University and also author of Apollo's Arrow. It's so great to have you on. I'm glad to be talking to you today.
David, thank you for having me.
So there are so many things that we can say about the medical handling of this global 100-year pandemic, about governmental failures or successes, vaccine development, et cetera. But one of the things that I find interesting, which you've talked about, are sort of the cultural aspects, what we learned and what was exposed maybe about American culture over the last nearly year of dealing with the global pandemic. Can you kind of frame that conversation for us and explain what we should be thinking about when we think about culture and the pandemic?
Right. Well, I think you already highlighted one important factor, which is something I would lead with right away, which is this way that we have come to live in this last year. And a lot of the things that have happened, for example, the death of healthcare workers, or a lot of the denial and the lies that we have seen about the pandemic. Many of these features seem so unnatural and alien, but it's important to understand that plagues are not new to our species. They're just new to us. We think all of these things are so unusual and weird and unnatural, and how can we? But that's just not true. And in fact, when you study the psychological, social, and economic responses to the COVID-19 pandemic, you see that many of those responses actually have obtained with pandemics and plagues going back thousands of years. So let me give you a couple of examples. Let me start with a really simple one, which is the death of healthcare workers. Many people are aware of the fact that, many hundreds of American healthcare workers and thousands of healthcare workers around the world have died caring for patients who are sick. In fact, one of the reasons we should behave better is to reduce our imposing risk on these people of dying caring for us. Well, Thucydides in the Plague of Athens in 430 BC talks about the death of healthcare workers. Pope Clement VI in the bubonic plague in 1347 talks about the death of nurses taking care of patients. This is not new. Or lies and denial. We've seen huge amounts of superstitions about, you could use bleach to treat the condition, or Bill Gates is going to inject us. The vaccine has, microchips. This is ridiculous. Or denial, including at the former president, the White House saying it's going away. There's nothing happening. It's going away, which was completely false and known to be false. This response is typical of human beings during times of plague, because we don't want to believe that this bad thing is happening to us. And on and on. I could go on. I mean, blame, for example, the desire to blame others is, again, very typical. We saw this during bubonic plague when there was anti-Semitism. The Jews were blamed. We saw it during HIV, when gay people were blamed, or Haitians were blamed, or IV drug users were blamed. There's always this desire to blame someone else when there's a time of plague. Anyway, I could go on, but there are these things that are happening to us. Or I'll say one more thing and then I'll shut up. There's a lot of misunderstanding about what is happening to us in terms of the economy, for example.
Yes.
So people think that the economy is collapsing because of what the government is doing to us. But if you read accounts of plagues going back thousands of years, for example, John of Ephesus, a priest writing about the plague of Justinian in 500 AD, talks about how the economy collapses. Everything slowed and ceased. People were not out and about. There was no government that was ordering schools or businesses to close in that period. It's just, this is what the virus does. It stops social interactions, which therefore stops the economy. So all of these things that we're seeing are a once in a century event. And we just, I think, have to accept that and maturely confront it.
I interviewed Brian Greene during the pandemic, earlier in the pandemic. And one of the things he pointed out was that he thinks there's a certain naivete to thinking that if we were to make contact with intelligent alien species, all of our earthly problems would all of a sudden seem sort of quaint and irrelevant, and we would come together as a global people because now this thing that transcends our problems has taken place. He thinks even that is probably naive to think, that there would be some initial instinct of that, and very quickly we would go back to our normal problems. Is there a similar naivete? And I think the answer clearly is yes, as evidenced by the last many months, to think that something like this would have allowed us to cross the partisan bickering and not to devolve into the same sort of arguments, the politically aligned arguments that we see with abortion and taxes and so many of these other things. Is it just fundamentally naive to think that something like a global pandemic would cross those bridges?
Well, first of all, let me back up and say there's a very famous exchange between, I think it was President Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev, where Reagan says they're having an exchange about how they can work together. And Reagan says, well, let me ask you, if the Earth was invaded by aliens, would you come to our defense? And Gorbachev says, of course, And so this trope, this idea that's in science fiction movies that human beings would come together to confront a shared threat is actually deeply fundamental. And there's another very famous social psychology experiment or demonstration called the Robbers Cave demonstration, which took place in the 1950s, where 11 or 12-year-old boys were taken into a summer camp and divided into two groups.
Yeah.
And then their group solidarity was fostered. And then it was revealed that there was this other group nearby, and then group competition was fostered. And then the investigators contrived to have a shared threat and show that now, having created these divisions, they could undo the divisions. The shared threat was they contrived to have the water supply to the camp interrupted. So the boys had to work together across groups, right, to fix the problem. So there's all this background on exactly the topic that you're mentioning. And it is true that a shared threat can bind groups together. And many people have for years thought that a virus or a germ would have that effect. In other words, we all are human. We're all facing this deadly threat. We should work together to confront it. But there are a few features of epidemics, and this one in particular, that make that hard.
My guess is one is that not everybody agrees as to the nature of the threat.
First, and partly that's because this germ, serious and deadly though it is not as deadly as, thank God, it could have been. Just to be clear, we could have been facing a bubonic plague type situation right now on the planet. And many people need to understand this. It's just by the luck of God that we're not facing something that's 10 or 30 times deadlier, like in the movie Contagion. Anyway, this particular pathogen is serious. It kills about 1% of the people that get symptoms from it, but it's not so deadly as smallpox or bubonic plague, which I think would have galvanized public interest and maybe helped us transcend some of our political divisions. First point. Second, the germ struck us at a particularly vulnerable moment in the life of our society in terms of our intellectual life. We have, as a nation, lost respect for science. We have politicized the notion of expertise. We think that experts are elites who are trying to take advantage of us rather than just experts. Like if you have a car problem, I don't think I'm as good as my car mechanic in figuring out what the problem is. I want to pay someone who knows more than I do about the problem. And if you have a surgeon or anything else, there's expertise in the world, or a plumbing disaster, there's expertise in the world. But we have begun to politicize this notion of expertise to our detriment. We have high levels of political polarization and economic inequality already, century high levels when the virus struck. And finally, we have lost the capacity for nuance in our civic discourse. People say, oh, you're with me or you're against me, or things are black or white. But adults know that that's not true. Things are not black or white. Most things are shades of gray. Anyway, all of those things, plus the relatively low but still high level of death from this germ, have made it difficult for us to band together to confront it. Plus, I think, frankly, incompetent leadership in the former administration at the White House, which minimized the threat and did not act to protect the public interest. I'll say one more thing and then I'll shut up again. Many people say, well, okay, Trump didn't do so well, but what about England or Italy or other countries? It's true. Many other countries also did poorly, but many countries did well. And not just rich islands like Taiwan and New Zealand. Germany did well. Greece did well. We're the United States of America. I expected more from us. I expected us to do well in confronting this threat.
Yeah, Rwanda is also an interesting example, actually, of a country that did quite well. Certainly better than many might have imagined if they didn't know that much about Rwanda. When we think about the next year, a lot of the discussions are when will herd immunity be reached, but there's some pretty interesting pieces that suggest that what might be called the cultural end to the pandemic will come before the medical end of the pandemic, particularly if the most at risk are vaccinated first as is happening, and the deaths go down dramatically. So there's kind of a question as to whether the cultural and the medical ends will coincide. What are you looking for in terms of this next year when you look at the cultural impact, the rollout of vaccinations, the transition to a new federal administration handling this?
Well, I think you're highlighting the key issues. There's this notion of herd immunity, which is this idea that a population can be immune to a condition or immune to having an epidemic of the condition, even if not everyone within the population is immune. Let's understand, and through various calculations and making a accommodation for something known as the network effects, probably at least 50% of Americans have to have acquired immunity to the condition before we get herd immunity. Now, when that happens, the virus is not gone. It still circulates and can kill people, but we've taken the wind out of its sails. Its epidemic force has been nullified when we get to this critical threshold. Now, we have miraculously invented a vaccine. We're the first generation of humans to confront the ancient threat of plagues that has been capable to develop a specific countermeasure in real time. It's amazing, but as we are all seeing in the news, we have to manufacture hundreds of millions of doses, distribute them, which is not easy, and persuade people to take them. And I think it'll take at least a year before we get to 50% or more, which is what we really need, vaccination, at least 50%. Meanwhile, the virus is still spreading. About 14% of Americans are infected so far. This has a long runway. So either way, I think it's going to take another year before we reach herd immunity. And during that time, we're going to have to live in a changed world with wearing masks, with periodic school and business closures, with gathering bans, with extra hygiene, and all of the headaches that we've come to be familiar with. And this is before the emergence of new, more communicable strains, which is another complication. So I think at least a year. And then we'll enter the intermediate period where some of the things that you mentioned will begin to obtain, which is we're going to have to begin to confront the psychological, social, and economic aftershocks. Because let's not forget, tens of millions of Americans are out of work. Millions of people have lost, businesses have closed. Millions of children have lost schooling. There's a disability. Several hundred, probably 2.5 million Americans will be disabled by this condition. Between 500,000 and 1 million will die. So we're going to have a lot of recovery to do. And I think it'll take a while. But come 2024, approximately, these are approximate, I think we'll finally enter the post-pandemic period. And then I think it'll be like the roaring 20s of the 20th century. After the 1918 influenza pandemic, we'll have a roaring 20s of the 21st century.
Yeah, one of the things that I've not seen discussed that much, which I think is important and interesting, is I never believe at the time when in May Donald Trump was saying the measures that some want you to take are more damaging than the virus itself. I thought that was dangerous and a disaster. But I do think that there is an aspect of this, which is after a year or a year and a half or however long it is of this feeling that the world outside of your house is hostile and dangerous to you, seeing two people close to each other with no masks looks like an act of something more than what it used to be, right? This stuff becomes ingrained. That doesn't get undone in a month or in 2 months. And I'm curious as to what the long-term group psychology impacts of that are going to be.
That's exactly right. That's what I was suggesting, that when we get to early 2022, we'll finally have put the biological and epidemiological impact of the virus behind us. But there's still going to be a lot of psychological and other recovery that'll take a couple of years, judging again from also the history of past epidemics. Just like you said, not everyone's going to take off their mask a year from now, right? For a variety of reasons, people are going to still be wearing masks. Some will be cautious. The virus will still be around. Other people will have immunodeficiencies. Some people will have habits. They'll be worried, etc. So it's not going to be instantaneous, nor will any of the other recovery be instantaneous. It's going to be a long and enduring shock. I think what people need to understand is we happen to be alive like our grandparents were alive when the world was at war, right? Like when I talk to my Greek relatives in Greece about this in their 80s, their frame of reference is not like the typical American. It's like a European who's used to having invading armies. My father remembers the Nazis invading Athens when he was a boy. So for him, that was like a once in a century event. And now this is another once in a century event, So I think people need to understand that this is quite a serious and unusual experience to us. Again, for humans have been, plagues are in the Bible, they're in Shakespeare, they're in Homer, they're in Cervantes, there's nothing new about plagues per se, but for us, it's quite a new experience. And we have to understand, much as we wish that this had not happened to us, and much as we wish that it would end quickly, it's not. It's just not what plagues do.
We've been speaking with Nicholas Christakis, who is Sterling Professor of Social Natural Science at Yale University, also author of Apollo's Arrow. I so appreciate your time today.
David, thank you so much for having me.